everybody. I'm Colleen Forestieri. I work with the Buren Conservation District, and welcome to our, hey Chris, can I have you just mute yourself for just a minute?
Yep.
I'm getting some feedback. Maybe it's just me. Welcome, I'm Colleen Forestieri. I work with the Buren Conservation District. You guys are here on our Thursday Backyard Symposium, where we've invited Chris Swinson to speak about mushrooms. I am definitely a wannabe mycophile, so I'm really excited that he's here today, and I'm so excited for the group who's joined us today. And I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we got started. Let's see. So we have muted you guys, and you guys can't see each other just to keep it less busy, but we have a chat feature that you guys are welcome to use. We also will have a Q&A where you guys can submit some questions to me, and I can help pass those on to Chris at the end. Chris will, I'm calling him Chris, but maybe it's Christopher. Christopher will present till about 2:50, and then we will leave some time for questions that you guys have for him at the very end of his presentation. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of information. You can message us through this contact form and sign up for our newsletters that we have at the bottom of our website. You can follow vanburencd.org /contact-2. You can follow that website to get a hold of us for anything. This webinar is going to be recorded. No one's names or faces will be seen except yours, Christopher, and mine. And we will put all of our webinars from the week and last year's Backyard Symposium on our YouTube channel. So if you did subscribe to this, you will get an email within a week or so with these recorded webinar sessions. We also have turned on our live captioning so people can read along as well as listen. And as I said before, we have a Q&A icon that you can click on to submit questions to me for the presenter. And then you can also put some things in the chat, and I will use both of those to help ask questions to Christopher at the end of the meeting. All right, so I think that's all. We have some more people that have signed on. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it over to Christopher to get started. So I think he's got a lot of information, and I'm going to mute myself. And welcome, Chris.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be able to do this presentation, and I'm glad that there are people interested in learning about this. To tell you a little bit about myself, I own a mushroom farm in Grand Rapids, and my partner and I and a small group of employees, we grow and sell between 300 and 600 pounds of mushrooms per week, depending on the season. We mostly sell at farmers markets all through West Michigan and the Lansing area. So we do a lot of markets, about 16 of them in the summer. And I've been doing that for 7 years. And because of that, I've had a lot of opportunity to buy and sell wild mushrooms. I've got to see them at all kinds of different stages and ages and quality. And it's given me a lot of insight that would otherwise, take a lot of time for someone to pick up on the topic. So it's fun to be able to share that with people. We teach classes at our facility in Grand Rapids, and the identification classes I teach are usually about 2 hours, but I'm probably going to extend them to 3 hours because there's a lot to know. So today will just be a real quick overview of what I think are some of the most important resources to help you further learn about Michigan mushrooms on your own. And we'll talk about a few species individually, but a lot of what we'll talk about is how to learn about mushrooms in general. So let's see. All right, that was just a little bit about us. We've been selling mushrooms since 2014, and mycophile, for those of you who don't know, is just an enthusiast or a lover of mushrooms. One of the things that I hear a lot from people is oh, well, all mushrooms without gills are safe to eat, or all mushrooms with gills are safe to eat. Or, if you cook a mushroom, that'll make it non-poisonous. A lot of real simple rules that people think might apply to all mushrooms. But the truth is, with mushrooms, just like life in general, nothing's really that simple. And so to really accurately learn how to safely identify mushrooms, you need to learn the individual species. You need to really learn their scientific names. Now, there are mushroom species out there that you can identify just by sight, and you don't have to know all of these intricacies of it. But if you want to go beyond the basic half dozen or so edible species, it's really, really helpful to learn a lot of the specifics. And so some of these slides, I won't go through all the details on today, but anyone who is viewing this can contact me later if you would like a copy of this slideshow. It has links and all kinds of resources in it. One of the things that is somewhat of a simple rule and is handy to know is that in North America, when it comes to shelf mushrooms, which are also known as bracket fungi, they are mushrooms that grow perpendicular to the substrate. A substrate is just anything that a living organism is growing on. And so mushrooms that grow off of the sides of the tree, like a shelf, by and large are safe. There are no, I should say, there's only one seriously toxic shelf mushroom in North America. Now, most of them aren't necessarily good edibles. A lot of them are woody and tough or bitter or may cause mild stomach upset. But as far as we know, there's really only one genuinely poisonous or toxic shelf mushroom in North America. And it's kind of small and orange and woody. It wouldn't be easy to mistake for an edible mushroom. It's called Haplopilus nidulans. So one good thing to know is that if you learn to identify this mushroom, you know that by default, any other shelf fungus or bracket fungi that you find in Michigan is going to be safe, regardless of whether or not it would be tasty. I really like to tell everyone that asks me about wild mushrooms about this website. Midwest American Mycological Information was a website created through a partnership between the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, working with a number of mushroom scientists from MSU. And they wanted to create a curriculum where people could learn about wild mushrooms, ones that are commonly eaten in the state, and then go and take a test to prove that they are knowledgeable enough to safely sell wild edible mushrooms to the public. For a long time, it was technically not legal to sell wild Michigan mushrooms within the state. At some point in time, it became illegal because every year people are sickened and occasionally die from misidentification of wild mushrooms. So about 7 years ago, the state worked with some scientists from MSU. They developed a curriculum based around about 30 of the more commonly eaten and also fairly easy to identify wild mushrooms that grow in our state. So I became certified in 2015. I just recently got recertified. When you go and take the test and get the license, it lasts for 5 years, and you're able to legally sell mushrooms at farmers markets and restaurants and to the public in general. And the test is, it's informative. You really learn a lot from it. You can actually go and take the class that precedes the test for, I think, only $75. So it's just a learning experience. You don't become certified, but you get to talk with mushroom scientists in our state, and you get supplied with this curriculum that they developed. If you want to become certified, I think the fee is $150. The really cool thing about it, though, is they made all of the information available for free online. So this website has kind of a wordy address right now. They're having some difficulties with it. So it has this temporary website, but hopefully it's going to go back to just midwestmycology.org. But either way, if you go to that URL at the top of the page, you can find all kinds of great information about the legalities of buying and selling mushrooms, information about poisonous mushrooms in our state, as well as everything you need to know to become a state certified wild mushroom expert in Michigan. If you sign up for the test and the class, they actually send you a physical copy of all of this info, but it is there on the website. So it's a fantastic resource. Even though it's designed to certify people as experts in mushroom identification, it really is a great tool for beginners as well, because it's very specific. It only covers mushrooms that grow in our region, and it only covers ones that would be somewhat difficult to misidentify. You would have to be reckless or unobservant to sort of mistake any of these for something that's poisonous. So it's a really great place to start. It's also handy because it's digital. You can access it anytime. They've got pictures, and in every listing for each of the species, they tell you very specific in scientific terms exactly how do I physically identify the mushroom, what its characteristics are, where it tends to grow at, what type of year it tends to grow, what trees or plants it may be associated with. So it's more than just how to physically identify them. It really gives you a lot of details about mushrooms, including really cool, interesting side notes and things about tips on preparation and storage and how to use different mushrooms that you might find in Michigan. Interestingly, there's over 100 edible species of mushrooms that grow in our state. So we live in a fantastic place to go and look for mushrooms. Outside of the Pacific Northwest and the American Southeast, where it's kind of perpetually warm and humid, the northern Midwest is the next best place to go mushroom hunting. We've got a wide species of them. And if you go a few hours north, we've got a lot of uninterrupted forest, and those really cold winters that we get up north make for even more robust and shorter but more condensed wild mushroom seasons. The same is true in the northern parts of Europe. They have fantastic mushroom seasons because their season is sort of condensed, and so there's more density of mushrooms, and there may be other things that cause it as well. But Michigan's a great place to go look for mushrooms. There's over 100 edible species. About 50 or 60 of those are commonly eaten, and 30 to 40 of them are really fairly safe and easy to identify. And that's mostly what this website covers. Another really handy resource created through MSU is this pamphlet. You can find it online in PDF form. You can also sometimes find physical copies of it at parks and what have you in the information center. It has kind of a wordy name, but I like it. Don't pick poison when gathering mushrooms for food in Michigan. Always a good idea. It's really neat because this pamphlet covers all of the really toxic, genuinely poisonous mushrooms that grow in our state. There can be some confusion about mushrooms because some mushrooms, in fact, many edible mushrooms, will cause stomach upset, sometimes pretty serious digestive issues if you consume them when they are raw or undercooked. But those mushrooms, the same ones, because they, if you were to cook them well, would not have these negative effects. Now, those are edible mushrooms. They just have toxins that are broken down by heat, or more precisely, stomach irritants that are broken down by heat. And so after we cook them, they don't bother us, but you would be surprised, at least some of us would, at just how many of the very commonly eaten and very popular mushrooms are known to cause stomach upset when they are undercooked. Some examples of these are chicken of the woods, morels, chanterelles, honey mushrooms, a number of others. Many of the very well-known, sought-after edible mushrooms can really make you sick if you undercook them, or even just overindulge in some cases. There are people who develop a sort of intolerance to certain species. But that is entirely different than a mushroom that is truly poisonous or toxic. A poison exists within a mushroom regardless of how you cook it. Some of it may break down through heat, but a mushroom that is genuinely poisonous is going to make you very sick or very ill or feel very bad one way or another, regardless of how you prepare it. There are some mushrooms out there that are mildly toxic, and people will prepare them in specific ways that seem to sort of nullify most of the toxin, but I can't really recommend that as a safe practice. And for any of us who are novices when it comes to mushroom hunting, it's not even something you need to think about. So this pamphlet's really handy because if you learn to recognize the groups of poisonous mushrooms that they list in here, then you know that whatever else you're finding in the woods is at least not something that's very toxic. There are a lot of mushrooms out there that we don't know much about the edibility of, or they may sometimes cause some stomach upset. But when it comes to ones that are deadly poisonous, we have a pretty good idea of exactly which ones are. There's not, mysterious mushrooms out there that we don't know anything about that are probably going to kill you in Michigan. So if you learn to identify all the known toxic mushrooms Anything else that you find is going to be safe. It may not be good to eat, but it's at least not going to be toxic. I highly recommend learning all the species in here. That pamphlet also covers some of the effects of the different toxins and also what kind of basic medical care could be provided should someone accidentally consume one of those mushrooms. One of the really handy resources that you pretty much absolutely need if you want to learn about mushrooms out in the wild is a good mushroom field guide. Field guides exist for all kinds of plant and animal life. There are many different mushroom field guides out there. A lot of them cover North America in general, but the best one for us here in Michigan is called Mushrooms of the Upper Midwest. It's pretty recently written. It was written by two women like within the last 10 years. It obviously covers our region of the country, and it's just a very well put together book. It's about 5x7 or 4x6 inches, so you can carry it with you when you're out in the woods. It has great pictures, it has great descriptions. It's definitely the best one I know of at the time for our area. The other one I recommend to people a lot is the Audubon Society Guide to North American Mushrooms. Now, this has been around for decades. I imagine they do release newer versions of it, so you want to make sure that you get a recent version of it. Mushroom taxonomy, or the scientific naming system we have for classifying different species of mushrooms, it changes a lot. We are constantly learning new things about the genetic relationships between different species and groups of fungi, and totally restructuring their scientific names and how they're related to one another. So it's really important to use up-to-date resources because, I know of a couple dozen mushrooms whose scientific names have changed in the last 7 years that I've been doing this. And I'm not a mushroom taxonomist by any means. I basically am just a mushroom farmer. So it's a real thing that you have to pay attention to when you're trying to learn about the identity of mushrooms. So the Audubon Society field guide is great. It's a little bit more complicated to use because they put all the pictures in the very center of the book. So you kind of have to flip back and forth. It's a little bit bulkier, but it's very common. I see it in stores. I know a ton of people that own it, and it's a great book as well. This mushroomexpert.com is basically an online field guide. It's a really handy website. It's created by a mushroom scientist based out of Illinois named Michael Kuo. Michael Kuo has identified over 2,500 North American species of mushrooms on his website. He describes the mushroom in specific scientific terms, the same terminology that you're going to see in any field guide, which is why it's important to learn those terms and learn those Latin names, because you really need to know some of that stuff to even properly use a field guide. So he describes them in very specific terms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And he also just has a lot of great tips and tricks and neat things he's learned over his decades of pretty intense mushroom studying. The second link on the page there is a really good introductory sort of article he's written for people that are getting into mushroom growing. He covers some of the basic stuff about how to store them, how to take spore prints, which can be helpful in identifying mushrooms, as well as tips on harvesting, like why you should harvest in rigid bottom baskets or containers versus bags. There's a few reasons for that, but one of them is that when you harvest mushrooms in loose bags, the mushrooms all kind of smush against one another. If there's a dirty or sandy mushroom, it will get the other ones dirty. Also, mushrooms sort of need to breathe. And so if you have too many in any kind of container sort of packed together, they will spoil more quickly. Also, they're really delicate. And just like a piece of fruit, if you bruise a mushroom, it's going to go bad faster, and it will start going bad where it was bruised at. So if you carry them in flat containers, you're going to have a lot less bruising. Some delicate mushrooms like black trumpets, a few others, chanterelles even, if they get heavily bruised, their shelf life can go from over a week to just a few days. So it's really important to be really delicate, both when you're harvesting and when you're carrying your harvest around. We're going to skip over some of these slides today, but I will explain this real quick. Taxonomy is just the classification system. And so a lot of what I teach in these classes is the Latin names of the different species that we work with. We won't have a lot of time to go over that today, but all of that information is available on the Midwest Mycology website. And while it's not necessary to know the Latin name for every species just to be able to identify it, it is extremely helpful. And if you want to go beyond just identifying a really basic set of edible mushrooms, you're going to want to learn the Latin names. It allows you to discuss mushrooms with other mushroom enthusiasts. There are mushroom groups in our state that go out and have forays. There are people who lead classes out in the woods. And so when you work, if you want to, interact with that community and learn from them, it's really great to know the Latin names as well as the common names. Another really good reason is that common names are not specific. Common names of mushrooms, just like common names of plants, are overlapping. They change from region to region and even from time to time. A couple examples of this: there's 2 mushrooms in our state known as beefsteak mushrooms. One of them is entirely edible. It almost actually looks like raw meat, and it's a shelf mushroom that grows off of a tree perpendicular to it. It kind of resembles raw liver. It has a texture that's similar to that. People, it's called a beefsteak mushroom for that reason. There are another group of mushrooms that are sometimes referred to as false morels or beefsteak mushrooms. They're in the genus Gyromitra. Some of them are edible. Some of them are edible if you prepare them right, but can actually be quite toxic. And one of them has a large amount of a well-known toxin in it. People still sometimes choose to prepare it a certain way and then consume it. But over time, it is a cumulative toxin that causes liver damage as well as neurological damage. Occasionally, people just outright die from it too, instead of a sort of a over the time cumulative poisoning, which is more common. Now, that group are known as beefsteak mushrooms. I don't eat any of them. Plenty of other mushrooms I can consume. I grow a lot of mushrooms. I find a lot of mushrooms in the woods, so I just choose to totally avoid the Gyromitra genus. But I would absolutely eat a beefsteak mushroom off of a tree because it's a completely different group of mushrooms. It contains no toxins, but it's one example of overlapping common names. Another quick example is hedgehog mushrooms. We have 2 mushrooms in Michigan known as hedgehog mushrooms. Both of them have what's called teeth or spines or hairs on the bottom side of the cap. So most mushrooms have sort of a cap and stem shape. Well, these mushrooms have little hairs that hang off the bottom of the cap, and it kind of looks like the spiky little hairs on a hedgehog. So they're called hedgehog mushrooms. One of them is totally edible. In fact, it's a pretty sought after edible mushroom. It's in the genus Hydnum. It's called Hydnum repandum. It is within this curriculum that I keep referring to from the state as well. You can go learn about Hydnum repandum there. But the other hedgehog mushroom is in the genus Sarcodon, I believe, and it's called a scaly hedgehog. It's scaly on top, it's tough, it's rubbery, it doesn't taste good. It's not toxic, but it's just one more example of why you really want to know specifically what species of mushroom you're working with. I have had people bring me scaly hedgehog mushrooms before and try to sell them to me because they were unaware that there's more than one type of hedgehog mushroom. The other sort of group of terminology or words that we spend a lot of time on in my identification classes is the morphology of mushrooms. That's the study of the form or the shape or the physical characteristics of them. So I've referred a couple times already to the genus of different species, and I imagine a lot of us, know or remember from sophomore biology class that there's a whole list of, kingdom, phylum, all these different groupings for the taxonomical names of different mushrooms or different organisms at large. But the ones that really matter for us are the genus and species. And there are sometimes a couple divisions below that you occasionally see within studying about mushrooms. But for the most part, you just need to know those 2 aspects of the Latin name. I am definitely skimming over some of these slides a little bit quicker than I would normally. But again, if anyone has questions after this, you can either send it through the chat or contact me after the class, and I'd be happy to explain some more or send the slideshow to you. But the example I have here, Ledoporous, The genus Ledoporous is the genus that chicken of the woods mushrooms are in. For those of us that don't know, chicken of the woods are a large, orange, meaty, fleshy, very edible mushroom that grows in Michigan. They're one of the most easily identifiable mushrooms. They grow on a tree primarily in the fall, and they can get up to 80 or 100 pounds. They are often 40 or 50 pounds. So they're really easy to mushroom to hunt for. And they, on the inside, have a texture that's actually similar to cooked chicken. You can kind of shred them like chicken, and depending on how you prepare them, they taste really similar to a white meat as well. It varies from specimen to specimen, but a lot of times you can almost perfectly mimic chicken if you use them in a dish correctly. So they're a lot of people's favorite mushrooms. They're definitely one of my favorite mushrooms. And we're lucky enough here in Michigan to have 3 different species of them. The third one, Ledoporous huroniensis, it was named after the fact that it only seems to grow in the Great Lakes Basin region. So it's associated with Lake Huron. And that's where the species name came from for that mushroom. The other 2, and I should mention, that one's not particularly sought after as an edible. It's not real common. It tends to be chalky and woody. However, the first 2, Ledoporous Alfurious and Ledoporous Cincinnatus, those are the most sought after species of the whole genus. There's over a dozen species of Ledoporous worldwide. In a lot of parts of the world that have them, they're not necessarily edible. There's a few species that grow west of the Rockies that are inferior or even inedible compared to the species we have here. One of those grows on eucalyptus, and it tends to make people sick. But here in the Midwest, we've got the 2 most sought after species. And Ledoporous cincinnatus, it's actually probably, or it is the most sought after. It's a very tender chicken of the woods. It's not as prone to getting dense and woody because instead of growing on the side of a tree, it actually grows on the ground next to a tree. It doesn't have to hold itself up against gravity. And so it tends to have a softer, looser structure, a more palatable texture. And that mushroom is named after the fact that it tends to only grow from the roughly the Cincinnati area over to the East Coast. So they named it after Cincinnati, Ledoporous cincinnatus. And then the top one, Ledoporous Alfurious, is the chicken of the woods that most of us know. It's the big, bright, blaze orange one. Grows on the sides of trees, almost exclusively oak trees. It mostly grows in the fall, but you can find it in spring and summer. You can also find it on other hardwoods like maple and beech, and occasionally others, but predominantly it grows on oak trees, and predominantly it grows in September and October, occasionally into the beginning of November. Now, Ledoporous sulphureus on the top side is bright orange, but the bottom side of each frond or leaf sort of the mushroom is bright yellow, and that's what it's named after, the sulfur yellow coloration of it. The Ledoporous part refers to the fact that it's a mushroom that has many small pores on the bottom side. So we're accustomed to mushrooms that have gills like portobellos and shiitakes, those membranes on the bottom of the cap that release the spores. But there's a whole group of mushrooms, many thousands of different species that don't have gills, and instead they have teeny tiny, almost microscopic holes that open up with age when the mushroom matures and they release the spores. A lot of those are called polypores, or they're in genus that, or genre that have names like Ledoporous, referring to the fact that it has many small pores. There's a picture here of some Ledoporous from last fall. My partner Jess is in the picture on the right holding a large tub of them. And you can see in that tub, there's one that's all yellow and doesn't really have any orange on it. That's actually the bottom side of one of the large clusters of fronds. Mushrooms, when they have individual sort of leaves, are known as fronds, just like a palm frond. And so chicken of the woods is made up of many large, thick, meaty fronds that sort of grow on top of one another in this shelf-like appearance on the side of a tree. The picture on the left has a few examples of hen of the woods. Those are the brown and gray ones. Hen of the woods is also a polypore. It's also a mushroom that consists of many different fronds. However, it grows from the root system of trees in the fall, almost exclusively oak trees as well. Its season kind of overlaps the season for chicken of the woods because it only grows in the fall from, we'll say, late August until early November. whereas chicken of the woods mostly grows then, but it can grow other times of year. Hen of the woods, though, is just another example of a polypore. It's a mushroom that does not have gills. Instead, it has many small holes on the bottom side of each frond or leaf. A couple of tips I like to give people about chicken of the woods. It's kind of a tricky mushroom to gauge the quality of, and you really want to eat it when it's on the younger side. Here's a picture of Ledoporous Cincinnatus, the softer, more tender one that grows from the root system of oak trees. Now the picture on the left, those are too mature. They faded in age. They don't have a white margin around the outer edge of each frond, which tells me that they have finished growing and they've released their spores. All mushrooms change in texture and flavor when they release their spores, and it's almost always for the worse. You generally want to get mushrooms before they've released their spores, because just like a piece of fruit that's finished ripening, once they release their spores, they're done, and their lifespan drops off, and their taste and flavor diminish as well. The picture on the right is a Ledoporous Cincinnatus that is still growing, and I can tell it's still growing because the margin is bright white. That bright white color is actually what the bottom of the fronds also look like. It's sort of a creamy white in real life. So the bottom side of Ledoporous Cincinnatus is creamy white. The top side is pastel orange and occasionally bright orange. And then with Ledoporous Alfurious, the top side is bright orange. The bottom side is a very bright yellow. And then as you can see in the picture on the right, when they get really old, the fronds become flat and thin and brittle. They lose their color. The edges start to sort of get wavy and undulate as they become compressed, and you definitely wouldn't want to eat one at that stage. Chicken of the woods is a hardy mushroom, so it can stay on the tree for weeks and weeks, but it's really only good to eat for like a 5-day window. If I see one that looks like the one on the left, where it has not yet flattened out, it has thick, chunky fronds that almost look like fingers sticking out of the tree, I'll usually pick them at that stage. If you wait even 2 or 3 days, sometimes they will have become less palatable, and usually the inner portion closest to the tree will be tough and woody, whereas one that you pick at that stage is entirely edible when they're still young and thick and chunky like that. I just looked at the time and realized we're already at 2:30, so I'm going to try and sort of breeze through some of these real quick here. This is just a real interesting mushroom called the lobster mushroom. It's actually a parasitic mold that grows on 2 existing host species. And basically, the reason I include it in here is because its scientific name is a really good example of why it's important to learn the scientific names. The scientific names aren't just, random Latin words, but they're self-describing. And so if you know the scientific name, when you're out in the field looking at mushrooms, it will help reinforce the physical characteristics, because they're describing the physical characteristics of the organism. And that's true for all Latin names of different organisms. But this is a mold that grows on top of another mushroom. And one of the mushrooms it can grow on is called Lactarius. Lactarius are named for the fact that they release this milky white latex. Sometimes it's other colors, but a milky latex if you injure the mushroom. That's where the lact comes from, just like lactate. So Hypomyces lactiflorum, the lobster mushroom, its scientific name literally means Hypomyces is on top of a mushroom. Hypo means on top, myces, just like myco, means mushroom. So it's something that grows on top of a mushroom. And then lactiflorum refers to the fact that it's fluorescent orange, and it's often found growing on top of Lactarius mushrooms. So if you find some Lactarius mushrooms in the woods, some of them are turning orange, other ones are completely orange. You know that they're not normally orange, then well, there must be something orange growing on this. And if you know that the lobster mushroom's scientific name is Hypomyces lactiflorum, you're probably going to figure out pretty quick that's what you're dealing with. This is also a great and interesting mushroom to talk about because it's easy to identify. It doesn't really have dangerous lookalikes. There is a toxic mushroom called the jack-o'-lantern that is ground-dwelling or terrestrial and is toxic. But for the most part, there are not many ground-dwelling orange mushrooms in Michigan. And the ones that do exist tend to be safe. They also don't really look like lobster mushrooms. So it's a safe mushroom to hunt for. It actually tastes like seafood, and I'm not exaggerating about that. There are some mushrooms that have really distinct seafood-like flavors. And not every specimen you're going to find is going to taste like lobster, but some of them do have a really distinct seafood flavor. So they're fun, interesting, cool mushroom to find. So a couple more important things about mushrooms is a lot of what we talk about in these classes are these terms that you're going to see if you do start reading different books about mushrooms or using mushroom field guides. And I don't include them to, seem fancy or try and, make things more complicated than they need to be. I include them because these are the agreed upon terms that mushroom scientists and botanists have decided to use to describe these different features of the mushroom. And so if you start reading a field guide, you're out in the woods and you don't know any of these words, it can seem intimidating or like gibberish or like Latin to you, and sometimes it is. And so it's really important to learn some of these basic terms because you will then be able to use the books and websites that I recommended previously. I won't go through all of these descriptions, but I'd love for you guys to look at them later or contact me. All of this information within this sort of chart here, those terms I just showed you are all in the Midwest Mycology curriculum that I referenced earlier. And they explain them all, they give definitions of them. That curriculum is really designed for a beginner level sort of introduction to mushrooms. I highly, highly recommend studying that website and taking the class if you'd like. Scales are one of the examples of a feature that mushrooms can have. Both of the mushrooms in these pictures are actually edible. The one on the left is called hawkswing or dryad saddle or pheasantback. And it's in the curriculum I keep referring to. The one on the right is called Coprinus comatus or shaggy mane or lawyer's wig. It is also edible and in the curriculum. I don't think I said the scientific name of the hawkswing, but it's Cereoporus squamosus. A couple of years ago, it was Polyporus squamosus, so it's an example of a mushroom whose scientific name has changed recently. These two mushrooms both have warts. They are not edible. And in fact, the one on the left is a toxic mushroom that can grow in Michigan called Chlorophyllum Molybdenus. It's the #1 cause of mushroom poisoning because it tends to grow on people's lawns, and they're big and white and kind of pretty. And for some reason, some people feel inclined to eat them. They're not deadly, but their common name is the vomiter, and it is appropriately named. Areolae are small raised bumps on the surface of mushrooms. These mushrooms in these images are Amico mushrooms that we grew at our farm, but you can definitely find areolae on a number of species in Michigan. This species is called Fuliot and Amico, and it is not native to Michigan, but we do have other Fuliotas that grow here. Striations are vertical lines on a mushroom cap. The stem or stipe, more properly, of the mushroom also has specific characteristics that may or may not be present, and sometimes a single characteristic can be the difference between an edible and inedible mushroom, or even a toxic and non-toxic mushroom. So you really want to be careful when you're venturing into learning about mushrooms. As I keep saying, there's a lot of mushrooms you don't have to be an expert to identify. Chicken of the woods is a really good example of that. Hen of the woods is another. But at the same time, there are mushrooms out there that are edible and have deadly lookalikes and may share all but 1 or 2 features with those lookalike mushrooms. So I don't say that to discourage people, but to encourage you to be informed as you continue on your journey learning about mushrooms. These are Amanita mushrooms. They have a distinct characteristic in that they grow out of an egg-shaped sac in the ground, or an egg-shaped sort of hard rubbery structure. It's called a vulva. It's also called a basal bulb sometimes, although that's a little confusing. But this egg-shaped structure that they sort of burst their way out of, they actually kind of leave a broken eggshell sort of flaps around the base of it. And so this mushroom and all of the mushrooms in this genre or genus, they all possess the same characteristic. They form in an egg-shaped structure in the ground. They are also an extremely deadly genus of mushrooms. And so this is a mushroom that if you were out identifying it for your first time, you would want to make sure that you dig up the base of the stem. That's true for any mushroom that you don't know. If you're out there identifying mushrooms, it seems like an unfamiliar mushroom to you, Or even if you just want to be careful, it's a really good idea to dig around the base of the stem and make sure there are no underground or partially submerged structures that may help you in identifying it. Sometimes that partially submerged structure might be one of the only features that distinguishes it from a dangerous mushroom. And if you break it off at ground level, you would not know that. This mushroom or this group also often has warts on top because as they grow through that egg-shaped structure, the outer membrane on it actually sticks to the cap of the mushroom. And then as the mushroom cap grows and expands, it tears apart into many small pieces that get further and further away from one another. So on those orange mushrooms in the picture on the left, you can see the very small mushroom has a very tightly packed warts on top of it, whereas the grown-up mushroom has warts that have spread out from one another. The age difference between those mushrooms is probably less than 48 hours. So mushrooms can vastly change their difference, or vastly change their appearance, their size, their shape, and even their color in as little as 1 to 2 days, which is yet another reason why you should be cautious and informed about eating and identifying wild mushrooms. Another example of Amanita mushrooms. This is not a species that grows in Michigan, although we do get the orange ones from the previous slide. But I wanted to include this as just an example of how quickly their shape can change. I would guess the age difference between the smallest mushroom in these 3 pictures and the largest mushroom is less than 5 days. Sort of depends on the temperature, but they can really change a lot in a day or two. This mushroom also has a number of important identifying features that are very well displayed in these photos, like the skirt or annulus that hangs around the stem about a third of the way down. That's actually the remnants of something called a partial veil. We may or may not have time to get into that today. We're nearing the end of our presentation here. This is an image that is used in the Midwest Mycology website and curriculum. I highly recommend that you go and study it yourself. They also have images to help describe different aspects of the shape of the cap and the stem and all kinds of different parts of the mushroom, how the gills attach. Everything you need to know is on that website. Same thing with the pileus or cap. Gill spacing is another identifying feature that's really important to differentiate some species. And then the veil I referred to a minute ago. The veil actually grows when most mushrooms are very small. The cap is sort of enclosed, almost like a sphere on top of a post or a lamp post. And then as the mushroom starts to grow and the spores inside of the cap mature, it begins to slowly open up. And eventually, once the spores are fully mature and the mushroom has reached sexual maturity, the cap opens enough that air currents can get in between the gills or the pores or the teeth and carry away spores in the wind to continue the life cycle. So many mushrooms, as they start to open up, there's actually a thin membrane that goes from the stem to the very margins of the cap. It covers the bottom of the gills and protects them while the mushroom is forming and slowly revealing itself. Then once it reaches maturity, that membrane reaches its physical limit, it gets stretched, it breaks away, and sometimes it falls and hangs down on the stem. It's called a veil or an annulus, and it can be attached to the mushroom in different ways, and that is often an important identifying feature for different species. The universal veil is that membrane that I referred to earlier. It's almost like an eggshell. It covers the outside of the vulva or egg-like structure that some mushrooms form in within the ground. As it breaks apart on top of the cap, it turns into warts or small tufts that kind of stick off the cap. One thing I should note too is it is not attached to the cap. You can actually wipe the warts off, and a hard rain can remove them as well, which is yet another reason why you should be informed and cautious when identifying wild mushrooms. This is just another good chart of another example of an Amanita. Here's a few of the more easy to identify mushrooms that grow in our state. And then the remainder of my slideshow at our classes, we talk about some of the more challenging ones, ones that people don't have a lot of familiarity with, exactly how to identify them and find them, little bits of information about where these mushrooms grow, what they look like. These are chanterelles here. Chanterelles are one of the most sought after edible mushrooms in the world. We get a lot of them in Michigan. Same is true for these black trumpets, really tasty, really interesting, sort of gourmet kind of mushrooms. Honey mushrooms grow in the fall. These are actually really interesting. Mushrooms are the flower or sexually reproductive organism of a, organ of a much larger organism. And so the body of a mushroom is actually a diffused network of mycelium. Mycelium are these root-like thin little, literally microscopic filaments that grow and form together and sometimes grow into thick strands, but they're individually are really fine little pieces of mushroom roots, basically. They grow through the substrate, which can be a soil or a tree or manure or leaves, whatever it is that mushroom grows on. They grow through it, they exude digestive enzymes, they break down the substrate and they absorb it back into the body of the mycelium so it can store up enough mushroom or enough energy to produce mushrooms and fruit or flower, you could say, when the season and other conditions are right. Well, the mycelium for this mushroom, the Armillaria, in the Armillaria genus, it can actually grow underground for vast areas. It's a parasite to trees that it encounters. So it kills trees and continues spreading through a forest, creating openings. It can actually sometimes cover multiple square miles. In Crystal Falls, Michigan, we have a colonies, right, not the right word, but a growth of honey mushroom mycelium under the ground that has been there for hundreds and possibly thousands of years. It covers hundreds of square acres. And every fall, it produces these tasty edible mushrooms. So mushrooms are a lot more than what we see. What we see is just this sort of ephemeral thing that's here today and gone tomorrow, when in fact, the body of a mushroom can sometimes live for generations. Another picture of honey mushrooms at different stages. We've got a few species of them here in Michigan. The picture of Hericium. Hericium erinaceus is lion's mane. This mushroom's really neat. They have a distinct flavor from most mushrooms. They have been shown to be potentially beneficial in treating neurological disorders, neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, things like that. They grow in the fall and early winter here in Michigan. They're not too common, but they're very safe and easy to identify. They don't really have any lookalikes except for the two other species of Hericium. Hericium americanum is bear's tooth or bear's head tooth. And then Hericium coralloides is the coral tooth mushroom. All three are great edibles. They really have no lookalikes. They're a really fun mushroom to find. And supposedly they may help you retain brain volume and brain connectivity as you age. So super cool, interesting mushroom. We get a lot of different species of Plurotus here in Michigan. Plurotus is the oyster mushroom. So, or I should say there's a lot of different types of them. You can find oyster mushrooms in Michigan that are brown or tan or white, and there's actually about three or four actually distinct species that we have here now. The picture on the right is myself holding a very large cluster of what we call our Michigan oyster strain. That's an oyster mushroom that we cloned in the wild in November of 2015. We've been growing it for years here at our facility. We've probably produced 10 or 12 tons of that exact same organism because it's a clone of the mother that we found. So it's really fun to be able to grow. And in the wild, that mushroom can be tan, it can be brown, it can be nearly white, it can be small, it can be big. It just depends on the temperature and the amount of sunlight that it receives. We also have, and this will pretty much be my last slide, we have a type of mushroom here in Michigan called the golden oyster mushroom, also known as Plurotus citrinopileatus or pileatus. It's really interesting because this is actually an invasive mushroom species, which is very uncommon. Mushrooms don't tend to naturalize themselves to new continents very well, or even new regions of a country. There are mushrooms that grow on one half of North America and not the other, and vice versa, and they never seem to cross, even when people will intentionally cultivate them in different, in the part that they don't usually grow in. They don't escape cultivation and become established. Another good example of that is shiitake. People have been growing shiitake mushrooms on oak logs in Japan for 800 years. People have been growing shiitakes on oak logs in North America for at least 70 or 80 years, yet they do not grow in the wild here. Supposedly, people have found some in the wild, but it's extremely uncommon. They are not naturalized to our continent, even though we have the same trees. The golden oyster, however, was unknown in North America 10 years ago. It's native to parts of Europe and Asia. And then around 7 or 8 years ago, it was found in Iowa and has since spread incredibly rapidly across all of the Midwest. They're extremely prolific. You can find 60 or 80 pounds of them on one tree. They have an extremely long season. They fruit every other week, basically. So they are displacing native species. I didn't grow them for a long time at our facility. We have a rural greenhouse that we grow a lot of our mushrooms in. But before we ever even grew them there, we found them on the property on multiple trees. So I do grow them seasonally now. Mushrooms can literally release hundreds of millions of spores from a single mushroom. So trying to stop their spread is pretty difficult. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now, though. I want to leave a few minutes for some questions. So thank you all for listening.
Wow. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
I already put the field guide in my Amazon cart for this year, and definitely thinking about taking your course. Now we have about 5 questions, but I was wondering, Christopher, do you have a website or a final slide, maybe why we asked some of your questions, that some contact information for our attendees? Because I have a feeling you're going to have more questions than just what's in the Q&A.
Yeah, let me share my screen real quick. All right. So if anyone wants to take down that info real quick.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to start with some of the questions.
Sure.
Lisa was interested if you could discuss mushrooms as an antidepressant, or if you knew of any that had antidepressant qualities, maybe.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of interesting. There's not a ton of human studies on that specifically, but there are a ton of anecdotal examples of people claiming that mushrooms like chaga and reishi and turkey tail seem to cause a mild sort of increase in mood or focus or energy, or an antidepressant or anxiolytic, anti-anxiety type effect. So those are 3 examples: chaga, reishi, turkey tail. But also lion's mane that we talked about earlier can cause a mild sense of well-being, and in some people, even a mild sense of euphoria.
And they sell those all at health food stores, I believe.
I do.
And maybe you sell them as well.
We do sell them.
Great. So Cindy had a question for you. She said, what are the orange finger-shaped fungi that grow on wood mulch? And I wonder if she means like those slimy, gross, smelly ones.
Yeah. So there's a whole group of mushrooms. They're not all related to one another, but they're called stinkhorns because they have a very horn-like shape. They tend to be hollow. They grow really quickly. And instead of having a cap with gills, they have a pile of stinky slime on the end of them. It actually attracts insects that would normally be attracted to manure or carrion. And so that's what spreads their spores for them. And they really like wood chips, which means, unfortunately, they like people's landscaping.
I think they're cool looking.
They are cool.
Maybe it's lucky when you get them. You just don't want to step on them. Cindy had another question. She said, do you know if wild animals eat mushrooms?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because there are a lot of wild animals that will eat different types of mushrooms. And in fact, there's even wild animals that have knowledge somehow, whether it's innate or learned, of which mushrooms are toxic and which aren't. But squirrels, deer, even raccoons and mice can all eat some types of mushrooms. A good thing to know, though, is that just because any mammal can eat a mushroom and safely doesn't mean that any human can.
Because they're eating them raw, and you kind of made the point for us not to do that.
Yeah, with wild mushrooms, you should always cook them. And even, just the way our physiology is, there's things we can eat that our dogs and cats can't. And it's the same for squirrels and deers.
Yeah, we had that experience this year with our long, mild fall. My dog ate mushrooms. We didn't even know where they were, where she was eating them, and she ate them a number, like over and over again. She didn't learn
Oh,
her
really?
lesson,
Yeah.
and she would just vomit and, feel kind of lousy. But yeah, it's just because, we can eat them.
Yep.
Maybe
Gotta
they
be
shouldn't
careful.
be. Right. Okay. So Emily had a question for you. She said, do you have any recommendations on resources for recipes for mushrooms that are found in the upper Midwest?
I have two I can think of off the top of my head. One is a website, a person that goes by Forager Chef, and I think his website is foragerchef.com. If I'm not mistaken, he's actually based in the upper Midwest, like Minnesota or Wisconsin. And then the other thing I can think of off the top of my head isn't specific to our region, but it's a mushroom-oriented cookbook that was released in the last year, put together by the same group of people that released a documentary called Fantastic Fungi. I have it here somewhere, but if you look up Fantastic Fungi Cookbook, you'll be able to find it.
Great. Okay. So let me see if I can get this. Emily said, thank you. Let me see if I can get this question right. What is the culture of growing mushrooms? Like, so maybe the medium? I'm not quite sure if that's what Dave meant. The
It's
medium that you're growing in,
it
or the
and
culture, maybe
if that is
sorry.
the question, basically, like it depends on the mushroom, but there's a lot of mushrooms in the wild that you can cultivate and grow in like um, sawdust or wood chips or leaves or compost. There's a whole bunch of different species that will grow in different things. As far as mushrooms that are usually commercially cultivated, including the ones that we grow, they mostly grow on a sawdust-based mixture. And so if you guys can see, there's like 13 tons of bags behind me that are mostly full of sawdust. Those will all grow mushrooms out of them eventually.
Chris, get back with me if that was not the question that you were asking. We have one from Elizabeth. It says, where do most mushrooms grow in Michigan? Are they specific to different areas? If so, are there guides to where varieties grow?
So your almost all edible mushrooms tend to grow in hardwood forest. There are exceptions to that, but most pine forests tend to deter fungal growth for the same reason we use pine and cedar to, build closets and stuff. They deter insects and they also deter fungal growth. So most edible mushrooms you're not going to find in a pine forest, but hardwood forests, particularly in August, September, and October, are the best places to go look for mushrooms. Any well-aged hardwood forest will have edible mushrooms in it, especially after a rain. But the single species of tree that has the highest number of mushrooms associated with it are oak trees. Oak forests are fantastic places to look for mushrooms. And as far as actual physical places to go in Michigan, you're legally allowed to forage mushrooms for personal use in any state game area, any recreation area, and even in national forests. Now, that's not the same as a national park. Do not ever pick anything in a national park. But national forest, like Manistee, you're absolutely allowed to go and forage mushrooms for personal use in.
That's super helpful. Let's see, we got a couple more questions. We are getting close to the end of time, so we may go over just a little tiny bit, but if people do need to drop off due to time, we hope to not keep Christopher too much longer. So let's see, Heather had a question. Do you grow wine caps? Is that the easier to grow at home?
Yeah, actually, I didn't get a chance today to touch on cultivation at home, but for simple low-tech ways people can grow mushrooms at home, there's about a half dozen species that you don't need to sterilize anything for. You can really just buy what's called mushroom spawn, which is kind of like seed. And one of these is wine caps, one of the examples of one that's real easy to grow. So you buy mushroom spawn or seed, then you take it and spread it out in a bed, a pile basically of moistened straw, cardboard, and wood chips. There's a handful of species that will grow on that. There are also others that prefer a little bit of compost or a little bit of leaves mixed in, but wine caps are a really aggressive mushroom species. If you mix that spawn into a bed of those things I mentioned, place it in an area that's shaded and moist, but doesn't get waterlogged and doesn't get a lot of direct sun. Usually if you do it in the early spring, by midsummer, you'll start to have these big, pretty purple and white wine-colored mushrooms grow. They're totally edible, and they can grow all summer long, even late into the fall. And that bed, the mycelium stays alive in it through the winter. It'll overwinter, so you just every couple of years feed it more wood chips, and you have a perpetual source of mushrooms in your yard. And we do sell spawn for wine caps. I actually really need to get on making some for this spring. So.
Awesome. There are actually a couple more questions, Christopher, in the chat. I don't know if you can stay on for a little bit longer, or if people want to stay just a few more minutes longer. I don't mind staying on a little bit more because I know people are excited about this. But I just wanted to talk to the rest of the group that does need to run at 3 o'clock. And I wanted to thank everyone for attending. We had a great attendance for Christopher's presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this. He was super knowledgeable. It sounds like you can always contact us if you can't get a hold of him, and we'll connect you guys as well. This was recorded, so look for that recording, because I know, you'll probably want to go back and get those tidbits of information that was shared. And just remember that we have another one of these webinar series happening tomorrow. We'll be talking more about permaculture, so don't miss that one. And reach out if you have any other questions for us. But I am gonna allow us to go back to the chat a little bit more, which I don't know if I'm allowed to do that or not, but since nobody is telling me I can't, I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that David had. He more meant, it was the question about it says, what is the culture of growing mushrooms? And then he said pH requirements. So I think he was asking about medium.
Yeah, so there's really not a whole, most natural plant-based materials will be within the range that at least some types of mushrooms can grow on them. So, we mostly grow our mushrooms on a sawdust-based substrate, but we also use like soy hull and wheat bran and a mineral called gypsum. I don't know the exact pH requirements, but I do know that a lot of mushrooms are fairly non-specific. Oyster mushrooms can grow on coffee grounds, they can grow on straw, they can grow on old newspapers, a roll of toilet paper, like they're pretty non-specific. And obviously if they grow on coffee grounds, they can handle some acidity. It really just depends on the species. For every substance that exists in nature, more or less, there exists a fungi that can consume it. So there are fungi out there that can consume extremely alkaline or acidic things, but most of the ones that you grow for edibility tend to grow on fairly neutral stuff like sawdust.
Great. I think you're just getting some people excited to try some new experiments.
Good.
I'm going to do one more question. We have a lot of good comments about how fascinating the program was, and I hope this is like an intro maybe to some of the courses that you do provide, so people can really get more knowledge if they're interested. But Bob had something really interesting. He said, my Polish grandparents and family went mushroom hunting around Grand Rapids for something called button heads, and they primarily grew around oak tree stumps. Do you think that they're called honey mushrooms, or that's the other common name for them?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, honey mushrooms have a ton of common names. Button mushrooms, stumpers, golden honey mushrooms. But yeah, if they were almost certainly honey mushrooms.
There you go. I don't know if Bob stayed on for that, but yeah, lots of good questions. Great content. We really appreciate your time, Christopher.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
And yeah, thanks for sharing your information so everyone can find you. My last question is, do we find you on Instagram?
Yeah, we are on Instagram and Facebook.
Okay. Okay.
And
I'll look.
Right now we have like identification and cultivation classes that are all sold out on our website. But in the next week, I'll be listing more. So if you guys are interested in that stuff, take a look at our website.
Now with your classes, so it's a lot of hands-on, you actually take people out into the woods and do anything like that, where it's more of a hands-on walk tour?
We're hoping to this upcoming season. I actually just bought property that's adjacent to a park. And so we're hoping to do that probably in the late summer or fall. The ones I offer this time of year are classroom based, and they're kind of based around the same curriculum that I kept referring to today. And then we also do cultivation classes as well.
Awesome. Well, you're a wealth of knowledge, and it was
Thanks.
a pleasure to hear your presentation. And I got your name wrong. This is Christopher Swinson.
Thanks.
Is that right?
Yep. And Chris,
Sorry about that.
is fine, but I appreciate that. So
Great.
thanks for having me.
Great. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.